The M11 Monochrom is the fourth rangefinder from Leica to employ a black and white sensor. And actually, hold on, no. We're not doing any of that. Look, this black and white sensor, what makes it interesting is that when you remove the color filter array, you have more light that can reach your sensor and more accuracy in your final image. Because the sensor is only responding to luminosity, the end result is that you have photographs that have more dynamic range to them and more clarity to them than their colored counterparts. Before we get to the photography, let's just take a look at this camera because this thing is blacked out. There is no iconic red logo on the front. In its place is a black screw. And when you look at the viewfinder, there's a slight dark gray trim on this viewfinder compared to the original M11. And the bayonet lock, that little button to release the mount for your lens, that's also black as well. It just looks so clean. Looking at the top of this camera, the shutter speed and ISO dials only use white and gray text on them. There's no red accents here. Looking at the shutter button, this one is also blacked out. And toward the top center, you see monochrome engraved right there. All of this comes together for an effortlessly cool looking camera. And this thing, it is an absolute killer. If you're asking me, I think it's probably the best looking camera on the market right now. It's just blacked out. It's just reserved. It's like John Wick, an absolute killer, and especially at night. You like that segue? Cool. Let's talk about the photography, because this thing is insane. Look, no matter what, a black and white only camera is gonna sound crazy to most people, and that's a rational response to have. The idea of a luxury rangefinder that has no autofocus, no video, that's already a bold proposition. And now you throw in the fact that there's no color, well, it straight up might trigger people. But here's the thing, if you live in black and white photography, there are three major benefits to a sensor of this kind. The first being is that because this sensor, it doesn't have these red, green, blue channels competing for light and it being interpolated back into an image, you just have more light that's gonna hit your sensor. When you have more light hitting your sensor, it means that you have a higher ISO ceiling and you have more dynamic range in your final file. The end result is a camera that's gonna be performing a lot better at equivalent ISOs, and it's also gonna allow you to shoot in much darker environments. The second benefit with a sensor like this is that you have images that have more sharpness and detail to them. Because there's no color interpolation happening, the sensor's just reacting to luminosity, you have something here where you're gonna have more clarity to your image, especially when you punch in for more detail, it's gonna be more precise, more accurate. And especially when you're talking about more dynamic range, all in all, it comes together for this more accurate representation of whatever your subject may be. And while sharpness might not be everything for most people, this does play into the next benefit. The noise response on this camera is absurd in a great way. You see, you have no color noise, obviously, so automatically it's less jarring when you're shooting in high ISO environments. But because of the increased clarity and detail, the results of noise, it looks less muddy. It actually looks more accurate. And let's also remember that because this responds better at equivalent ISOs, you can shoot at a higher ISO and often get a better result than the color counterpart. What this means is that if you're shooting in the cover of night in really challenging environments, you can be quite liberal with your ISO. You can throw this thing up and really push the camera to its limits, because most often than not, you're gonna get a result that looks easily better than the color counterpart, but it has more of a film-like look to it. And that's because the grain, along with M lenses, it's reacting in a non-linear way and it's more precise. It doesn't look like this digital blotchiness that's happening on, typical sensors in the market. So yeah, a no color camera is gonna sound crazy to most people, but if you live in a black and white world and that's where you do most of your work, the M11 Monochrom looks to be the pinnacle of that experience. What I love about Leica is they use DNG files, so even though this camera is not officially supported, I can import them into Capture One, make a new session, you know how much I love sessions with Capture One Pro, and start comparing these files to my SL2S and really looking at how it interprets color differently. All right, so we have two files here. On the left, I have the M11 Monochrome. On the right, I have the SL2S. We shot the same subject, same lighting, same lens, except this one is converted to black and white. I just desaturated the image and I brought it down 1/3 of a stop just to match the ISO setting of the M11 Monochrome image. And once you punch in, you actually look at the texture of the fruit. I think this was the most interesting example for me, is that you see there's more tonality and gradation over here on the monochrome sensor than there is on a color sensor being converted to black and white. And when you punch in and you're looking at the details and just the overall clarity and sharpness of the image, it's pretty evident that as you look at a monochrome file, it has more sharpness, it has more clarity to it. It just feels a little bit more precise than a color image converted to black and white. What I appreciated is that you seem to get more tonality. When you're looking at skin, when you're looking at, for example, the texture of fruit and leaves, there's just more tonality in the black and whites. It's not the same as taking a color image and desaturating it and converting it to black and white. There is a real difference here. Now, the obvious question is how much of this difference means to you. If you produce in color or you're kind of 50-50 between both worlds, it might not make that much of a difference. However, if you are purely working in black and white or largely working in black and white, these are some real differences that you notice right away. The other big benefit is ISO. I'm going to talk about this again. It was staggering to see. And again, even pushing this thing to north of 100,000 ISO, I was very impressed at how it controlled and mitigated the noise. And most often than not, it wasn't unpleasing. It wasn't like color noise where all of a sudden it kind of deteriorates the image. This is something that felt more like film. It's not going to be exact, but it was closer to that than the digital counterpart on a color sensor. All right, while we're in Capture One, let's take a look at something. This is interesting. We have the SL2S on the right, and as we change the white balance, you see how it's actually impacting the image, right? That's because there is color information beneath this file. So even though we've desaturated it, it's changing the actual file, the interpretation of that, right? Let's go to the monochrome sensor. Immediately when I click on the monochrome sensor, look what happens to our histogram. No color information, no RGB channels. When you go here, you see the color channels. Here, nothing. So as you change white balance, it's not going to do anything. It's not going to do anything at all. Okay, let's look at something else that's interesting about this file here. So I'm looking at the SL2S file, and in the black and white mode, you can go in, and this is one of the powerful features of Capture One, right? Is that you have pretty robust black and white control, and you can actually look to change the red and blue and green and cyan and magenta and yellow channels to change what your black and white representation looks like and feels like, right? If you go to the M11 Monochrome, you can hit that enable black and white button, but this is not going to do anything, right? And like, this shouldn't be a surprise, but I thought I'd just highlight it for anyone looking at this, that, yes, there are no color channels. There's no way to sort of use color beneath a black and white image to manipulate the file. This thing is only reacting to luminosity, and so you have that pure black and white experience. When you have a color sensor, right, you have the red, green, and blue channels. So when you clip your highlights, it might be just one or two of the channels that are clipping. So you can actually go in and bring the highlights back. You don't get that benefit with a monochrome sensor because it is only responding to luminosity. If you clip your highlights, those highlights are gone. You're actually not going to be able to bring those back. There is no information to really bring back. So this is a great example of that. Now, what I've been doing with the Leica M11 Monochrome to mitigate this is actually using the highlight weighted metering. So it's looking at the brightest point of the image and then setting the exposure. And even with that, underexposing by 1 stop or 1 1/3 stops, just to make sure that none of the highlights are going to be clipped, or the majority of the highlights are not going to be clipped. In this example here, though, you can see that we have some of these highlights that we're just not going to get back. The nice thing is, though, artistically, it's the highlights that I probably don't mind blowing out a little bit. Along with the monochrome sensor, you have the triple resolution functionality that was introduced with the Leica M11. This means that you can shoot in 60, 36, or 18 megapixels, where the sensor is dynamically changing the photo sites to give you marginally better dynamic range and noise performance as you stop down in resolution. The Leica M11 Monochrome ships with 256 gigs of internal storage, which is great. And what's wild is that when the Leica M11 was originally announced and came with 64 gigs, that was already a big deal for photographers. But then you look at this one, the Monochrome, and it has 4 times that amount. And then you look at the original like it's some sort of degenerate gambler that lost its life savings on crypto. It's weird how technology does that. Okay, that's a little extreme. But it is funny how technical advancements change our perception of the status quo. When you have 256 gigs of internal storage, it means that you can do a redundant backup of your RAW files on the go. One to the SD card, one to the camera, and not worry about storage in most situations. I think people are gonna just be elated, excited, exuberant, whatever adjective that starts with E, to have a camera like this where you have a ton of reliability and availability on the go. And like I mentioned in my M11 review, I'm hoping that other manufacturers are looking at this and straight up copy this. Start putting internal storage in more flagship solutions. One more small but important upgrade to this camera is that instead of the standard Gorilla Glass on the back LCD, you're getting sapphire, which is the same material used in premium watches. This has me excited. It means that, well, if it performs anything like my Apple Watch, that you no longer have to put a screen protector on your camera, that you can just have this thing and get that full LCD experience without worrying it scratch and dent and really just deteriorate over time. Before I wrap this up, if you really love photography and you want to hear more about my adventures around the world, join the Church Street Foto Club. It's invite only but free to join. Again, only if you love photography. If you do, I think you're gonna love being a part of this club. I've only had a couple of days with this M11 Monochrome, but it's already piqued my interest enough to consider doing a full review. I do a lot of work in black and white. In fact, when I'm doing photography, I actually change my JPEG settings to be in black and white. I prefer to just focus on shadow, composition, and shoot, and then work with color after the fact if necessary. A camera like this, it just makes me curious because it's so polarizing and different. I just start to think, who's gonna benefit most from a camera like this? I also start to wonder, if I dedicate myself to this thing, how far could it take my work, or how much does it hold me back even? In simple terms, I really wanna find out how wide or narrow is the audience for a camera like this. Anyway, that's a conversation for another day. Look, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for your time and your patience. I was trying to make this channel a lot less gear heavy this year. And look, the way things are shaking out, it looks to be a little top heavy with that kind of conversation, but I promise you there's gonna be a ton of travel and experiential and educational content coming on this channel from all my adventures across the world, so stay tuned for that. So there you have it. That's my quick look at the Leica M11 Monochrome, what it can do, what's changed, what's upgraded, and what the photography is starting to look like. I'm more interested to know what you guys want to know about this camera. So let me know in the comments down below. Post any questions or even opinions in the comments. I'll make sure to get back to you there. As always, my name's Gadgen. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.